Thanks for coming, everyone. I have to say, I was only expecting my grandparents and a few of Jonathan's old friends to come, so...
I wasn't even expecting that.
Okay. Just the grandparents, but it looks like we've got quite a good turnout. We're going to try and split the time today talking both about Jonathan's long career as a journalist, a foreign correspondent, and also about his new book, which came out last month, The Ghosts of Afghanistan. We agreed to start off with you. I'll give a brief introduction, and then we'll find out how you became a foreign correspondent, and then we'll move on to the book, and then we're going to leave about half an hour for questions at the end. So if you're thinking of some questions, that'd be great. For those of you who don't know him, Jonathan Steele is one of the most widely experienced and respected foreign correspondents of our era. I grew up reading him in The Guardian, where he's successively been the Washington bureau chief and then the Moscow bureau chief, and finally he was the chief foreign correspondent at large. His writing, with its sense of history and vivid registering of detail, is in the best traditions of English journalism. Officially, Jonathan is retired, but he seems to have been keeping himself fairly busy. He interviewed Gorbachev in July, and am I right in saying this is your third book that's come out this year?
It's come out this year? No, it's the only one this year.
Your third book that you've written?
Sixth.
Okay, so anyway, so his latest book is the fruit of more than 30 years of visits to Afghanistan. We'll move on to that later. We'll start off with some more general questions about Jonathan. I guess the first question we should ask is, are you one of those people who was always wanted to be a foreign correspondent from when you were 7 or 8 years old, or was it something that happened by accident?
Totally by accident. You know, when you're usually, people ask that question to journalists, you know, how do you get into it? And it's usually a kind of combination of various things, sort of persistence, ambition, and a little bit of luck. In my case, it was an enormous dose of luck, about 95% luck. When I finished here as a student, got my BA, I went to the United States, to Yale, to do graduate work. And that was 1963. I arrived there about a month after Martin Luther King had had his huge march on Washington. The Freedom Riders had been trying to integrate public accommodation and everything else in the South. And the focus was shifting to voter registration, to try and give blacks the chance to vote. And there was something being organized in 1964 called the Mississippi Freedom Summer. Actually, we called it slightly less dramatically the Mississippi Summer Project. And if anybody of you remembers, there was a film, Mississippi Burning, with Gene Hackman as the main star. It was about that episode. And I volunteered, you know, I was kind of motivated to see more of America than just New Haven, Connecticut. So that was one motivation, but I was also, you know, I couldn't quite understand what was going on in the American South. It was the big news story of the time. So I volunteered with about 800 other people, nearly all of them Americans. I was one of the very few who were foreign, who went down to Mississippi that summer. And it was a sort of life-changing experience for almost everybody, including for myself. It was radicalizing, it was invigorating, and it was shocking, because we saw that this was a different face of the America that we'd been brought up with. John Kennedy had been in power for 2 years, and it was wonderful, and new frontier, Camelot, and all the rest of it. And suddenly we realized there was a very different America still lurking there in the shadows of the Deep South. And so I volunteered, and, you know, people were arrested. The day after I got there, 3 young men were abducted, and later we found they'd been murdered, and that was the theme of the film Mississippi Burning. And
did that spark the interest
well,
in journalism?
I'm just coming to that. Sorry, there's a rather long answer. I'll make sure that all the other answers are a bit shorter. We'll get on to journalism, but we've all asked, you know, to spread the word, to tell people what on earth was going on in America. So we were told to write to all our local newspapers, wherever you happen to be, and you know, get the word out there that this was terrible, what was going on in Mississippi, and people should know about it. So we were kind of bearing witness. This was the idea. It sounds a bit evangelical now, but we were supposed to be sort of bearing witness. And I think that is still part of being a foreign correspondent. You are sort of bearing witness. Well, so that was my first piece of luck, that I actually went to Mississippi while all this was going on. My second piece of luck was that I used a bit of the old boy network. I knew somebody who worked on the Times, and I sent this article. It was by an aerogram post. You know, it was very old technology in those days. It took about 5 days for this thing breaking news. To get to Printing House Square. I think the Times was still in Printing House Square at that stage. So my second piece of luck was it was turned down. So I never joined the Times. I then, having been rejected by the Times, I thought, well, to hell with this, I'm not giving up. I'll try the Guardian. So I sent to the Guardian. They printed it. So that was my third piece of luck. And then next year, I was still in America, came the Selma to Montgomery march in Alabama. And the Guardian actually asked me to cover that. And then after that, I
clung to the Guardian.
Clung to the Guardian. I wrote to them at the end of my time in America and said, you know, are there any openings for people? And they did still, in those days. It was abolished the year after I got in, fourth piece of luck. They had a traineeship scheme. They took 2 students every year, and so there I am. Okay. So I had 40 years with the Guardian.
But they responded. I mean, they
responded.
You were one of the only people who was there. Presumably, you had a story that they wanted.
Yeah, they wanted the story, and I suppose this is the 5th or 6th piece of luck. I've rather run out of numbers now. The people who we had paid to go to Washington and New York didn't want to go to Mississippi or Alabama. They thought, ooh, and so there was room for a freelancer.
We wanted to talk a bit about the changes in journalism between now and then. I wondered if there was a story or an account of something in your career that captures the sort of technological problems that you may have faced then. You know, was there a time when you struggled to get a story off, and that really reveals that perhaps the changes that we're faced by now, when someone like me is tweeting from my phone from wherever I am in the world?
Well, I touched on the aerogram thing, and we moved on from there. But the great thing about being a foreign correspondent in the days before mobile phones was it was a case of saying to the desk, you can't call me, I'll call you.
Wow.
So you could go off the map and do something for a day or 2 or 3 and really develop a story and work on something and go out of the capital city of the country you're in and really get to grips with what was going on. And so, you know, that was a terrible thing when mobiles came in.
Right.
And they could sort of ring you at any time and say, what is this nonsense? Why aren't you in story? Reuters has just carried this news flash, you know, why aren't you on the scene? So on, and turning you into a kind of trying to turn you into a sort of news agency quick reaction thing. So it was great until about 15 years ago when there were no mobiles. But there were downsides, and I think you're probably hinting at that in your question, because when I managed to get in 1991, during the aborted or failed Soviet coup against Gorbachev, I managed to get myself onto a plane which was carrying the Russian Prime Minister and other top dignitaries down to the Crimea to see what was going on, because the KGB chief, Vladimir Khrushchev, was putting out the line that Gorbachev was ill, and that's why he had to hand over to the vice president. Of course, everybody thought it was fake, but he said, well, we'll arrange a plane for you to go down there and you can see. So I managed to get on that plane, but
you were the only journalist on that plane?
Well, there was somebody from Barcelona and somebody from AFP, actually. There were 2 other Western journalists, and there was a Russian TV crew as well. But pretty much, I was certainly the only of this sort of English language newspaper, so I could push stuff out for the English language media. But having, you know, got to see Gorbachev, and by then, while we were in the air and the 2-hour flight from Moscow to the Crimea, things had changed. The coup people had pretty much collapsed, and Gorbachev was back in charge, and his communications had been restored, and he was about to come back to the Kremlin. But nobody knew that yet. So we had this world scoop. We'd seen Gorbachev, he was liberated, he was back in charge, and he was planning to return to take control again in Moscow. We had the scoop. how did we communicate it? As I say, there were no mobile phones. So you'd pick up a phone in this sort of luxury villa where he was living, you know, and there'd be somebody who would say, be a Kremlin operator, and you, even in your sort of faulty Russian, you'd try and say, put me through to this number, and they'd tell immediately you were foreign, and you were trying to dial a foreign number, and they just put down the phone. So it wasn't until I got back to Moscow about 6 hours later that I could actually start filing a story, by which time it was too late for the last edition of The Guardian. So I still had to sit on the story, which had, of course, broken by then in the wires, because Gorbachev had come back to Moscow and had been seen by everybody and so on. So there was, the story of his liberation was no longer a scoop. But it still meant that when I got the final story out in The Guardian 36 hours later, I still could put all that eyewitness descriptive detail and the exact quotes and all the rest of it, so it was still a damn good story.
But at that point you were...
So I say.
At that point, presumably, you would have hoped that there were mobile phones.
At that point, it would have been good to have a mobile phone. Or a satellite phone, actually, probably even better.
But even now, I think it's fair to say that there are some technological challenges for journalists. For example, I faced a difficulty when in Sana'a in Yemen with power cuts, because actually everything that I do and send anywhere relies on electricity. And you have to have electricity to get internet. So the weapon of choice for journalists in Sana'a is petrol-powered generators now. So you rig up a generator on the bottom floor and you run up a wire to the top. And then you have your one plug for your light bulb and the other plug for your internet modem. And everything's dark and pitch black, but you can still communicate with the outside world. Anyway, that's a bit of a side point. Are there any, I think I should ask you if there are any, or one particular story, aside from the scoop of Gorbachev, that you were most proud of? Not necessarily it was the best, most highest quality, but something that you really felt afterwards that it's a story you would always look back on. Was it something short and snappy?
Well, yes, I think there was a story in Kosovo in 1998, because as I've sort of hinted, this bearing witness thing is still very much a key motivation of mine, because when you're on a domestic story, it's not quite the same thing. I mean, when you're doing investigative stuff and exposing a corruption or some scandal of, there is a sort of bearing witness element to that. But it's still within the context that most of your readers understand the thing. When you're abroad, you're really sort of telling people about something which you think they ought to know about, even if they live thousands of miles away in London or in Britain. And there was a story in Kosovo in 1998, I think it was around June, when we began to get word that refugees were coming into Montenegro and Albania, and something sort of dramatic was happening inside Kosovo, which we didn't quite know about. And I was in Pristina, and the press corps was in Pristina, which is the capital of Kosovo, and but it's to the sort of east of it's a very small country, it's about the size of Wales, but Pristina's on the east, and all these refugees were coming from the western part of the country. So somehow we had to get from Pristina to western Kosovo to find out what was going on. Well, all the access routes out of Pristina were blocked by Yugoslav army and Serbian police, so you just couldn't get through. We were completely sort of cut off. And I suddenly remembered that there was a railway. And it was all in a terrible rush, and it happened on Friday evening of the week. We sort of got word of all these refugee movements. And I wanted to go there. And luckily, as I say, it was Friday. It was important because there's no Guardian on it was too late to do anything for the Saturday paper. There's no Guardian on a Sunday. So I had sort of at least 24 to 36 hours. By then, there were mobile phones, to sort of get on with the story without the desk demanding some short 400-word piece on this or that. I didn't even have time to get a fixer. I was actually staying with a young journalist and his family rather than in the big hotel with all the other hacks, because as well as being a sort of witness bearer, I'm a bit of a lone wolf. I prefer to not hunt in the pack, or with the pack. And this young guy unfortunately had some other engagements on the Saturday, and so I just sort of thought, well, I've got to go on my own anyway. I don't speak Albanian, but quite a lot of Albanians speak German, and some English, but more German. I do speak German, so I thought I can get away with this. So I took a taxi very early in the morning, but not to the main station in Pristina, because I thought that'll be controlled by Serbian police, possibly. So we went just down the line. It was only about another 5 miles down the line to the first stop after the Kosovo-Pristina station. And I got on this train, which was only full of Albanians. And it trundled through the Albanian countryside for about an hour to the place called Peć, or Peja, which is the sort of capital of western Kosovo. And on the train journey, it's pretty obvious to the other passengers I was foreign, and I explained what I was doing to people.
Were you worried at that point? I mean, was that...
No, not particularly, because I just thought I'm in a kind of friendly environment. I'm in a sort of Albanian environment. They're not going to do anything to me. So, people then kind of accompanied me from we got to the station in Peć to show me how to sort of walk in the right direction to avoid where the Serbian roadblocks were. And they took me first to a little office where there were people with a sort of typewriter, basically, typing out these leaflets. And these leaflets were saying to people, all in Albanian, of course, translated for me, saying, don't flee to Albania, don't go to Montenegro. The Serbs are trying to push us out. They're trying to empty this country. Stay here. Don't leave. And I said, what are you doing with these leaflets? They said, come with us. We'll show you. And we then walked across the countryside behind all the main roads that were controlled by the Serbs, just through fields and things. And I suddenly realized there were thousands and thousands of people who'd been bombed out of their houses, who were living in barns, 300 in this barn, 250 in another one, people sheltering in woods and things. And these leaflets were telling them, don't flee, stay here. Fleeing may save you in the short term, but you'll lose your homes forever in the long term. And nobody else got that story. And I then got the train. I spent the night in one of these barns, and then the next early morning on the Sunday morning, they took me back to the station, and I got the same train back again. And I had the whole morning to write this fantastic story, which led the paper on the Monday afterwards. So I was really pleased with that.
Right. I wondered if there are any qualities of a foreign correspondent that you think people really need, aside from luck, which is clearly one of them. Clearly there's been a lot of changes since when you were reporting then and now, but does that mean necessarily that the qualities that you need to be a foreign correspondent changes? And would you have any advice for someone here who, was looking for the lucky breaks that you got?
Well, curiosity is the first thing. I think that's why most people are journalists and want to become journalists. You've got to be curious, you've got to be interested. A willingness to listen, because you have to ask questions and then listen to the answers and take them in. An ability to communicate. There's no point if you've got the great story and you can't express it in an interesting way and communicate. And a good deal of persistence, because there are lots of closed doors all the time you have to push open. And I think this sense that you've got something special to tell, this bearing witness kind of thing. But I think the other thing is to, the occupational hazards of being a foreign correspondent are many. One is alcohol. Another is nicotine, although it's slightly less used nowadays. There's depression, which is probably more frequent than people like to admit. But the biggest one, I think, is cynicism. And because cynicism makes you glib, makes you flip, makes you turn off and decide you know everything, nothing will ever change. It's all these corrupt people, whether it's corrupt politicians or corrupt leaders of some kind or another. So I think you have to have a kind of, the best antidote to cynicism is anger.
Anger?
You have to have a kind of low intensity anger. That just
with
keeps
anyone
you
in
going.
particular, your editor?
Anger about the state of the world. Sometimes you have short-term bursts of anger against your editors and your colleagues and so on, but it's more about the state of the world, and you've got to believe it is reformable ultimately.
You've reported from many war zones and dangerous parts of the world, Afghanistan, Iraq, other places. How have you balanced up the need for preserving your own personal safety? Because often I find that every editor will tell you no story is worth dying for. It's this kind of their safe line, no story is worth dying for, don't go and kill yourself, whatever you do. But when you almost die, and then you write an amazing story and it's on the front page, they say, bloody good job. You know, well done. You didn't quite die, but you got the story. In a way, it's down to you to decide when, you know, the situation is too dangerous. And is that just something that comes with practice and with instinct, or have there ever been times when you said, I'm not going to go there because it's too dangerous for myself, despite the story?
No, I never actually said that, but I mean, you touched on a very good point, because along with all this ancient technology that we've thrown away was this sort of ancient feeling that journalists somehow are bulletproof. You know, you're safe wherever you go. So we never had hostile environment training. We never had flak jackets. We never had helmets and things. Until about 10 years ago, we would just go to all these places. And there were some stories in Kosovo, which I touched on, was one of them, where, you know, you almost did have this feeling that you could sort of cross the lines and you were completely in a different category. You know, like the sort of gods in the Iliad that can be on Achilles' side one day and then on the Trojan side on the other, and just cross and have a wonderful view of the battlefield and so on. Because, you know, in Kosovo you would cross through the Serbian roadblocks, and then, you know, an hour later you'd be talking to people from the Kosovo Liberation Army, you know, armed to the teeth and so on. And then you would come back in the evening and you'd cross through the Serb thing and then go to your hotel and file your story. Or there's a wonderful veteran New York Times correspondent sitting somewhere in this room. I won't point him out because I know he doesn't want to be, who was with me in El Salvador. And it was the same thing there. You could stay in your very nice hotel in the Camino Real in San Salvador. You would go out through the army checkpoints and things in the morning. You'd get out and speak to Los Muchachos, the guerrillas, in the afternoon or something. And then you'd come back to the Camino Real through the Salvadorian army checkpoints and file a story. And you just sort of felt, you know, they're fighting each other and we're just sort of walking through and walking back, or driving through and driving back.
But did you not feel sometimes you had to develop the knack for...
Well, you know, there were some terrible things, and there were 4 journalists who were brutally shot by the Salvadorian army in one situation, which happened, you know, before I was there. I think it was the first of those really terrible murders. But, you know, you sort of always think, oh, it's a one-off. You know, they were perhaps went a bit too far, or, you know, they happened to hit some terrible army commander who had a bad day or something. Yeah. You know, you kind of always rationalized it, and you know, looking back on it now, you can say it was incredibly stupid, but, you know.
I found that sometimes it's useful to be able to turn on the charm a little bit, and especially if it's a polarized conflict, like for example in Sana'a, things have become, in Yemen, more and more polarized. As it goes on, you're either with the government or against the government, and within minutes of getting in a taxi, you can tell straight away where he's coming from, and if you want him to take you to Change Square, the opposition, and you realize that he's not like that at all, you do develop a knack somehow for, you know, finding your place.
Well, I think the point is also, you know, the reason why it was safer to do what I've just described in Kosovo and El Salvador was the journalists were seen as sort of independent agents in some way. Well, agents is the wrong word, because they weren't seen as agents, they were seen as independent actors. Now, you know, journalists seem to have a value, so there's a value in taking a journalist hostage. There may even be a sort of negative value in shooting a journalist or killing a journalist, executing them, sort of frighten off other people. So I think we have been dragged into the battlefield in a way that we weren't 10 or 15 years ago, and it is rather dangerous, and it's partly because of this embedding thing that we are sometimes the only place to get to a story is to be embedded, which inevitably means you're taking enormous risks and being identified as part of one military machine or another.
Right. I'll ask you one last question and we'll move on to the book. Do you think there's a, when it comes to choosing where you're going to go, clearly The Guardian have, you know, a lot of say in sending you to places as a foreign correspondent, but have there been times when you thought, I ought to go, you know, what influences your decision to go to a particular place? Would you always go to the place where the biggest story would be? Or would you sometimes, as you were saying before, look for the, you know, the story that's not so heavily reported on from a sort of tactical point of view as a journalist?
Well, I mean, most big news organizations have a staff person in the capital cities. of the sort of major countries. The great thing about being a sort of chief foreign correspondent or a roving foreign correspondent is that you go to places by definition which don't already have a correspondent, you know, because it's not very nice sort of going in and sort of trumping the local person and saying, well, I've now arrived from London, you know, take over. It's much better to go to a place like Central America where you don't have a person on the ground, or at the beginning in Iraq we didn't. The story really takes the decision for you. You know, if the story's big enough, they'll want coverage. Right.
Okay. Well, we're happy to move on to the book now. Is that all right? I think we need to keep some time for questions at the end. I'll just briefly introduce the book. I'm going to read like a short section from the introduction. This is an incredibly timely book. It comes 10 years. Last October the 7th was the 10th anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan. It's the longest war in US history. The Americans have now been in Afghanistan longer than the Soviets. In a time of brutal economic cuts and recessions, I think I'm right in saying they're spending around $2 billion a week to maintain their presence there. And so obviously this is a very timely book, and I would really, really advise everyone to buy a copy. What Jonathan's done, which hasn't been done before, or that hasn't been done so well before, is to give a real sharp comparison between the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and the American occupation. And throughout the whole book, he's constantly drawing out and teasing out examples of where the same mistakes have been made over and over again, and trying to draw lessons from that. It's called The Ghosts of Afghanistan, and the ghosts that Jonathan's talking about are these, I think, I'll ask him about this, but I think are the mistakes that are being repeated over and over again. It uses an interesting technique of having myths. So Jonathan's identified 13 widely held myths, and throughout the book, they're scattered throughout the book, and he does his best to dispel them. We'll come on to the myths a bit later, but I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs from the introduction, which I think gives a good taste of what the book's about. I sometimes feel haunted. Memories of Afghanistan and the people I have met there float into my head at home, in London, or wherever else I happen to be. Memories and questions. What is it that keeps tempting powerful foreign states to spend soldiers' lives in seeking to control a country that is landlocked, not endowed with oil, and much poorer than its less invaded neighbours? Why does a society that so clearly needs economic progress and development always take up arms whenever a few of its leaders try to bring reform? Why does it succeed in forcing them to retreat? The ghosts of this book's title are not just my wandering thoughts. They are the ghosts of catastrophic mistakes made by earlier invaders that haunt Obama's war today. I saw the blunders of the Soviets made in the 1980s, and have watched most of them repeated in recent years. Anger and hubris that led to a misguided mission of revenge. Regime change that slips, undebated, into nation building. Surging more troops because those who died must not have lost their lives in vain. The first question I'm going to ask you is about the title. You've touched on what I just read there, but why the Ghosts of Afghanistan?
Well, in 1991, an exhibition opened in Moscow that had obviously been put together by a committee, because one section had been put together by the Soviet Ministry of Defense, and it contained sort of pictures and blow-ups of tanks and mortars and APCs and so on. And there was another section that had been put up by the mothers of Soviet soldiers, and it was a very simple little exhibition that had the dog tags of these dead boys and their names and some photographs and a few yellowing envelopes from the letters they'd managed to send back from the front line, and a few vases of flowers. And there was a third section of this exhibition which consisted of artwork by artists that had been sent by the authorities to cover the war. And there was one particular picture which made a very big impression on me. It was sort of like a split screen. That there was the top 2/3 showed 4 men in Soviet uniform, young men, 2 of whom were clearly wounded. There was blood there, and one of them had his arm in a plaster and so on. and helicopters in the background in these khaki mountains. And below that, the bottom third of the picture, was a group of men in dark suits and ties who were signing some kind of documents. And they were the Soviet and the Afghan Politburo signing some kind of treaty of friendship and cooperation. And the picture by an artist called Gennady Zhivatov was called Boys Playing at War. And what was so impressive about it was that the bottom third that showed these men in suits cut off the picture of the boys just below the knee. So they were kind of hovering in a strange ghostly way above the people who'd sent them into battle. And I was really impressed by this image and went to Gennady afterwards and asked if he'd make a copy for us, which he did, which I now have in our house in London. So the ghosts are also the dead soldiers. Soviet soldiers died, wasted lives, and the Americans who've done the same thing. But the word that the Soviet soldiers used for the mujahideen was actually duhi, which means ghosts, because they were elusive, invisible, and hard to get your hands on or shoot, just like the Taliban are to the Americans today. So the ghosts are the soldiers who've died. They are, of course, the tens of thousands of Afghans who died, more than 1 million who've died in the last 30 years, as well as my memories. So it covers a lot of ground, the ghosts.
I should add, before I carry on asking questions, that this is the accumulation of 30 years of repeated visits to Afghanistan. But why is it now, at this point, that you've chosen to write the book? I mean, was there something in particular that drove you to write it? And was there someone in particular you were writing it for?
No, I think it was just that I saw that this war seemed to be unending. And also, I was surprised, perhaps naively, that Obama had continued the war. I thought he would be different from Bush. In fact, he's tripled the number of troops in Afghanistan that Bush had. When Bush left office, there were about 30,000. There are now 90,000, just above, American troops. So I think it was in the that stage when we were beginning to say, you know, why is Obama just doing the same as Bush? I sort of thought, have I got anything to contribute? And I thought, look, if I can explain the similarities, what's gone on, and the differences, because there are some differences. In fact, Gorbachev did try and end this Afghan civil war.
Well, that brings me on to my next question, actually. You make a striking comparison between Gorbachev and Obama. Both inherited wars from their predecessor. Gorbachev came to power in 1985. The Afghans had been bogged down, the Soviets had been bogged down in 5 years of war. 9,000 Soviet troops had been killed, and he decided that the war was unwinnable. And his military commanders also told him that the war was unwinnable. Obama, on the other hand, came to power and declared that this was a necessary war. And his military commanders were encouraging him to send more troops, and as you said, he did. 2 surges, more American troops than Soviet troops. So I guess the question I'm asking is, by drawing that comparison, are you saying that what Obama needs to do, what Gorbachev did then, is what Obama needs to do now?
Exactly. That's exactly right. I mean, there are 2 wars in Afghanistan. There's a civil war, which has been going on since 1973, and there's been the 2 foreign interventions, which have only made the civil war worse. And Gorbachev realized that you had to end both wars if possible. But he didn't want to condition one on the other. He didn't say, I'm not pulling Soviet troops out until there's an end to the civil war, because that might have been a hostage to fortune. So he was saying, we are pulling out unilaterally, but we want to urge our clients in Kabul, the regime of Muhammad Najibullah, to do a deal with the Mujahideen to try and find a government of national unity. And he urged them to make contact and open dialogue with the Mujahideen, and also with the other big centre of resistance, which was the exiled king, who was living in Rome in Italy at the time. And it was undermined by the Americans largely, and the Pakistanis as well. And so that didn't come to anything. But it's now there's another chance of trying to do that. What I'm slightly concerned about is either that the Americans are going to stay in there forever, which they're trying to do at the moment, because while they're allegedly pulling out combat troops by the end of 2014, that's the Obama plan, they still want to keep a so-called residual force, could be several tens of thousands of US troops in there after that. They might not be called combat troops anymore, they might be called advisors or trainers or whatever, but they'll still be armed, uniformed US troops. And obviously the resistance is not going to pack up as long as that's happening, so that won't end the insurgency. So I'm saying that you've got to sort of have a government of national unity. That ought to be the American goal now, to try and open talks with the Taliban to persuade Karzai and the Tajiks, who are all very suspicious, particularly of the Pashtun Taliban, to realize that it's much better to have a consensus solution. Because otherwise the Americans might just pull out and leave.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Do you think that history is going to repeat itself, and that the Americans will leave, as the Russians did, and leave the Taliban in the south and the warlords in the north? And essentially,
well, that's pretty much what happened in 1992 when the Mujahideen came in. They started all kinds of factional fighting in Kabul, which, when I visited, during the Soviet occupation 3 times and then during the Najibullah regime, Kabul was almost an oasis of calm. There was no war going on, unlike Kabul today, where there are blast walls and checkpoints and life is very uncertain. It was completely calm. But in 1992, when the Mujahideen finally took over, the internecine rivalry was so strong, and each one wanted the power for himself alone, that they started shelling and artillery, and 50,000 people were killed. And Robert Gates, former defense secretary, who was in the CIA at the time, in his memoirs, said, well, the Mujahideen took over and there was a civil war and nobody cared. He actually says that. Nobody cared. It means nobody in Washington cared. And I'm afraid the same thing will happen again. Either the Americans will stay, as I've just mentioned, or that they'll leave and they will allow this civil war to re-emerge, and then they will sit back and say, well, we did what we could for the Afghans. We spent all this money. We lost 2,000 soldiers' lives.
It was their fault.
And it's their fault because they can't ever come together.
Well, something that you've said, that you repeatedly stress in your book, is the need for the Americans to talk with the Taliban, to meet face-to-face with them, and to potentially include them in what you say needs to be a national unity government. Why have the Americans been so resistant to talk to the Taliban? What have been the main sticking points? And do you think that they will start talking to the Taliban?
Well, now the latest thing from Hillary Clinton is that we're fighting and talking. Used to be we're just fighting. Now they're fighting and talking. It'd be nice if they were just talking. But they're sort of getting there. But I think basically it's just a slogan that covers what is essentially the continuation of the David Petraeus line is we'll fight these people to the negotiating table. We'll sort of clobber them and undermine them and brutalize them and kill enough of them that they will come limping and bloodstained to the negotiating table, and then we can get the best possible deal. Well, that's not how that didn't happen in Northern Ireland. The British government had to take a deep breath and say, we have to talk to the people who've got guns, and that means the IRA and their political organisation, Sinn Féin, and that is the only solution. You can't say, we'll talk to them in order to undermine them. You talk to them because you accept that they have grievances which are legitimate and have to be taken on board in a compromise deal.
One of the sticking points that I understand that you raised, you talk a lot about, well, you write a very good chapter which describes how the Taliban's brutal repression of women, their medieval attitudes towards women. You were in Kabul in 1996 when the Taliban took over Kabul, and you saw with your own eyes what happened to women there, that they were banned from going to schools and to universities, and that they were enforced, the full veil, the burqa, was enforced. But you mention you take the debate further in a way, and you look at the way in which the women's rights have been a sticking point. At one point you recall at the moment when a senior U.S. official was about to fly to Kabul to meet with Taliban officials, which would have represented essentially the first diplomatic recognition of the Taliban, and the flight was cancelled because First Lady Hillary Clinton and other feminists said you can't go and meet with them because it would be shame to be meeting with people who have those sort of attitudes. Now, I was reading a Telegraph review of your book, and one of the criticisms they have is to say that you have what they said is an inconsistent riff on whether improved women's rights should be a necessary part of the peace. I was wondering if you could respond to that, or develop that somewhat. I mean, clearly it's a very difficult issue, and it is playing a part in the way in which US policy makers think and act towards Afghanistan.
No, you're absolutely right, and women's rights was used as a sort of post factum justification for the attack on Afghanistan on October the 7th, 2001, because the whole point of it was to find Osama bin Laden. When they couldn't find him, the Bush people and Blair and so on said, well, at least we've toppled the Taliban, who had these terrible attitudes to women, and now that everybody's throwing off the burqa, and so we've done, sort of byproduct, side effect of this attack has been that we've liberated Afghan women. So it has been used, and of course it is a very serious issue, particularly for urban women. I think very little has changed for rural women in Afghanistan. In the Pashtun areas, they're still required to wear the burqa. In many other parts of the country, they also are covered up, and there are very few girls' schools and all the rest of it. And fathers don't allow their daughters to go to school, even if there is a girls' school very often. But clearly, urban women do not want to go back under the burqa, do not want to be stopped from having jobs and working outside the home. So
is that the impression you got from talking?
Well, that's definitely the impression I got from talking to them. But I did also I made a particular point on one of the trips I made, which was March last year, March 2010, of talking to sort of urban professional women about, what they thought about talks. It was just the beginning when the first idea was being raised about talks with the Taliban. And I tried to contact quite a number of people. And the sort of overwhelming impression I got from these women was that we want talks. The Taliban are our brothers. They are part of the Afghan family. Al-Qaeda's different. They're Arabs. They have a global jihadi kind of ideology. But the Taliban are an Afghan phenomenon. They're part of us, part of our family. And we've had war for 10 years now. We must find another solution. War is not going to work. And we have to talk to the Taliban. Now they didn't want they're not talking about surrendering to the Taliban. They're not saying we just sort of hand over. But
these are educated, urbanized
women in Kabul, professional people and so on. So I think there is that feeling, and some of them said to me, that security is the greatest human right, more important than a gender right.
Well, I was going to mention this because it almost gets into sort of philosophical debates in the sense that in the period of wartime, do rights like women's rights and gender rights, do they have to take the back seat in a way before, during times of war, if the main priority is surviving? But that's clearly quite a difficult position to be in, because there are very few people who would want to accept that gender rights can be ignored at any point, even if the people are being killed and there's shelling and stuff. But you do mention in your book the people saying that what we need right now is to be alive and for our house not to be exploded. But it's a difficult issue.
Of course it's a difficult issue, but I think that's why I try and stress in the book that, the sort of medieval feudal oppression of women it didn't begin with the Taliban. You see it in northwest Pakistan. It's not exclusive to Afghanistan, the burqa. The
Taliban encouraged it.
The Taliban made it worse, of course, by enforcing this rural code of conduct on urban women, so they extended it. But even with the Mujahideen, when they came in 1992, they insisted on the hijab. you know, in the Soviet period, you would go to the university campuses, the 2 universities in Kabul, and there were women completely unveiled, walking around, going to classes and so on, in the government offices, in the banks, in the shops and so on. There were women working, unveiled. So when the Mujahideen came in, they said hijab is necessary. So, you know, it already started to go back downhill when the Western-backed Mujahideen came in. So, and these things are very deeply ingrained culturally and in rural traditions. So that even if you even if there was the Taliban signed up to some bit of paper saying we don't want the burqa anymore, all women can work if they want to, and you've got a perfect constitution with all the sort of freedoms that you would hope to write in any constitution, it would still not be enforced or followed in many of the rural areas, because local men would not accept it for their wives and their daughters to go uncovered. So, you know, it takes decades to change these things. You can't just do it by the stroke of a pen.
We'll move on to questions shortly. I'll just finish with some forward-looking questions. You do spend a lot of time trying to give a more nuanced perspective on the Taliban, trying to make people think about the Taliban not just as ideological fanatics, but also you describe them yourself as pragmatists, potentially, and people who, you know, can be negotiated with. What do you think the Taliban want now, if the US and other powers are going to be negotiating with them? What is it that they want out of all of this? Well,
let me just preface that by touching on the earlier part of your question. I mean, demonization is a terrible thing, and it's one of the things that a good foreign correspondent has to avoid. Don't demonize any side, you know. Whatever your private views about who's right and who's wrong in any potential conflict, you know, you never demonize. And of course, when you do demonize, then it leads to ethnic cleansing and genocide and so on. So responsible journalism gets away from demonization. And so what I'm trying to do there is to stop the demonization of the Taliban and try and get people to see them. You know, that they have views which in many ways, you know, you or I might not accept, but you know, that is there. You have to, you know, not just sort of rule them out of the picture because of that. But what do they want? Well, it's very hard to know the answer to that, because there is no contact with the top leadership of the Taliban. They are, you know, prescribed people. There's a bounty on the head of Mullah Muhammad Omar and so on. He risks being assassinated if he comes out into the public. So it's very hard to get access to these people. So everything that I'm saying, everything that anti-Taliban people say is speculative. We don't know. So people who say, oh, the Taliban are just sitting, waiting there till the Americans leave because they know they'll be able to take over. How do we know that? That's pure speculation that the Taliban are just waiting. Maybe they are willing to negotiate more seriously if the US shows it wants to be serious. But, you know, we can go by their public statements. And again, you know, if you're going to be cynical, and I've tried to warn against cynical, you'll say, oh, well, their public statements mean nothing. You know, anybody can write a public statement. Well, you know, that's true of any politician, not just the Taliban. You have to sort of read the public statement, think about it, see how it differs from previous public statements, if it's changed, why has it changed, what could be the reasons, and you know, and then hopefully have dialogue with them and say, why have you changed your public statement, and see whether they've got a convincing answer. You know, the normal thing one does. Well, they have been, because in the statement that Omar made in September at the end of Ramadan, he came out in terms saying that we no longer want a monopoly of power in Afghanistan. In other words, we don't want to do what we did in 1996, which is to take the whole power. Over. He said we respect all the ethnicities and different views of different groups in Afghanistan. So he's trying to present pluralistic.
Any ideas for why?
And he said portfolios will be, you know, handed out on merit and not on ethnicity and so on. So he's sort of made all the kind of right, liberal, quotes unquotes, noises. Yeah. So that is important, because even if you say cynically, well, this is all rubbish, it's not just you reading it or me reading it, it's his followers reading it. So they're also thinking, oh, the leader has changed his line, you know. So it does have an impact on the followers too. It makes them think, well, if that's the case, why? And was what we used to think wrong, or has he just changed for, you know, opportunistic reasons? So it does start a debate within the Taliban ranks as well as within our ranks about, do we believe them or do we trust them?
Last question, 13 myths. Is there a master myth Is there one myth that we really feel needs to be dispelled? Is there one in particular that stands out?
And it's the "we walked away" myth. After the Russians left, we walked away.
We, the West.
We, meaning the West. Read the testimony that Hillary Clinton gave to the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee only 3 weeks ago. She actually used that phrase, we walked away after the Russians left. We're not going to do that this time. We're going to be smart and strategic. Great. Mike Mullen, the former heads of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, used the same thing early in the summer. Ryan Crocker, the US ambassador, man of long experience, was the ambassador in Islamabad at one point, then Baghdad, now in Kabul, used the same phrase in an interview with the Wall Street Journal in August. I mean, do these people know nothing about Afghan history? Do they know nothing about American history? I mean, in 1989, when the Russians left, and there was a 3-year interregnum with the Mohammed Najibullah regime, which was backed by the Soviet Union, was secular, modernizing, anti-Mujahideen, the CIA was continuing to fund the Mujahideen to try and topple him and win a military victory. They went on fighting a military war, even though there wasn't a single Russian soldier left in Afghanistan. And more importantly, as we touched on earlier, they undermined all the efforts by the Najibullah regime to have a negotiated government of national unity, because they told the Mujahideen, no, keep on, keep fighting, and you'll win the whole thing, you'll get the whole lot. And that really...
You're still feeling the ramifications.
Well, that's why I say, you know, the people who bear the greatest responsibility for the misery of Afghanistan in the 1980s, other than Afghans themselves, are the Russians. The people who bear the greatest responsibility for the misery of the 1990s, other than the Afghans themselves, are the Americans, because they shot down the best chance there has been until now of a government of national unity and a negotiated end to this terrible civil war. Now, glimmering sort of through the mist of the haunted battleground is the chance yet again of a government of national unity, and I just hope the Obama people have the sense to take it.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll open the floor now to questions. We have about half an hour. We're passing a microphone around. Okay, cool.
Hi. Hello, Jean-François from the Reuters agency. I have two questions to ask. One is about foreign correspondent in general, and their future in the ever cutting cost business of the news. And the second one is about Afghanistan. So on the first one is, do you think that we are moving towards an era where there won't be any more Western foreign correspondents sent to dangerous countries, and where news organization will work with local stringers all the time who speak the language and are more at ease in the country to reduce costs, essentially? And the second question is about Afghanistan. The editor of the Afghan Daily, I don't know if you read that publication, it's an English newspaper, had a chance to meet him in Hyderabad, and he said that one of the reasons he thought the Americans were completely failing in Afghanistan was because they had the wrong guy, they had put the wrong guy at the head of the country, and if Massoud had been alive after they did invade Afghanistan, it would have been a completely different story because he had much more backing from the tribal leaders. So I would like to comment on that, and whether you have actually had a chance to meet Massoud, and whether you think he would have been a better leader than Karzai.
Well, on the first point, I mean, I think that is the trend, that people are cutting back on all kinds of coverage because of the economic climate, and foreign coverage is one of the first things a lot of people cut back on, particularly bad in the United States, where TV news hardly has any foreign coverage at all. I mean, The Guardian's subject to that too, although we've managed to hold out as best we can, and Reuters, of course, is still very widely represented, and the BBC as well, but I mean, there is that danger. We have an excellent stringer who speaks Arabic in Yemen, in Tom Finn. So I think there is still scope for Western stringers in these countries. But why not bring on more of the local stringers? I mean, it's true that one of the bad things that's now passed away, you know, I was talking about how it used to be 20, 30, 40 years ago, was that we used to use these fixers and translators, and they were treated like second-class journalists very often. And it was only recently that they even began to get bylines on stories, let alone, you know, pay that took account of the dangers that they put themselves in for. So I think there has been much more respect and attention paid to local stringers, and a sense of responsibility, of duty of care given to them. And so why shouldn't they, you know, benefit from the chance to earn some money and to move on in their careers by working for Western outlets more and more? So I don't see that as a bad thing. I think it would be great if we had more local stringers from the countries that we're reporting on. On the Massoud thing, no, I never actually interviewed Massoud. I mean, I talked about not demonizing. The converse of that is not lionizing. Don't turn people into heroes. There are very few heroes around anywhere. And that's not a cynical remark, that's a factual remark. And Massoud became, it was literally called the Lion of the Panjshir. And a lot of people did this kind of adventure journalism. They would walk in, Western reporters, young, nearly always male, would dress up in the shalwar kameez and everything, tramp across the border, up the Khyber Pass and across the mountains and all the rest of it, and go and see Massoud, or they'd go and see some other Mujahideen leader. And he was built up into this great big thing. And I think he was unfortunately shown during the 1992-96 period, when the Mujahideen were in control in Kabul, to be very seriously flawed, because he was one of the leaders who was firing artillery shells at Hekmatyar in a different part of Kabul and so on, and also at the Hazara areas in the western part of the city. So his record is very bloody and very brutal and very harsh in the way he dealt with people in Kabul. I mean, even if he'd been a more you know, humane and pacific sort of person, I think the very fact that he was a Tajik would make a problem for him to be the supreme leader of Afghanistan. So even if he'd survived, I don't think he would have really had much purchase. I think probably it has to remain to be a Pashtun job, because the Pashtun are the biggest minority with 42% of the population. But obviously you don't want a one strongman person, you want some kind of cabinet where all the ethnicities are represented.
Stuart Hughes from the BBC. I wanted to pick up on one of the things you mentioned in your last answer. A few years ago, Richard Sambrook, who's a former BBC executive, released a paper in which he said, the title of which was "Are Foreign Correspondents Redundant?" To which many of us said, I wish they were, but they're not just yet. I just wonder, given the pressures that newsrooms are under now, whether you feel that you're part of a, if you like, a golden age of foreign correspondence, partly because of financial issues and partly because of the technological issues that you touched upon in terms of always being available to the desk in London. And my second question is, given that there are so many outlets and so many sources for foreign news now, what is the role of the Western foreign correspondent, given the fact that we can now see what's going on in Syria or wherever it may be? We may not be able to get a visa there, but we can find out what's going on on Twitter and YouTube. What's your role in that changed environment?
Well, I'm always hesitant to see things in terms of golden ages and to look back on the past with sort of sentimental kind of nostalgia. I mean, things move on and you have to accept that, and you know, there's good and bad in every era. And I mentioned some of the good and the bad things about you know, lack of communications in the sort of 1980s and 1970s. But I think there will always be scope for the kind of journalism that the BBC or the Guardian tries to put out, and that is providing context. It's not just breaking news. You know, breaking news become a bit of a cliche. It's not just, you know, suddenly having a sort of ringside seat at some kind of riot. You know, you're sitting in the West and you can sort of see Tahrir Square live and so on. you've got to sort of know what's happening. Why is Tahrir Square happening? Who's going to sort of win from this? What are the forces at play in Egypt at the moment? Who's likely to emerge strongest? It still requires people who have got some knowledge of the country, preferably some language skills as well, which we haven't mentioned much this evening, who can, really get to grips with this and explain. So that maybe the bearing witness part of what I've said the old foreign correspondent did has dropped away because, the TV set in the corner or your iPhone is bearing witness now. But now you need somebody who can explain it much more. And I think, with the Guardian, we're actually in a better position than the BBC, because the BBC is supposed not to have views and opinions and no op-eds and things. The Guardian, you're allowed to do that. I mean, one of the great things that I've been able to do in my sort of waning time is to be a columnist and a reporter. Now, this is anathema in the New York Times, where there's a complete, Chinese wall or apartheid wall between reporters and op-ed writers, as though, op-ed people are never allowed to go and report and see what's actually happening, and reporters are not allowed to think. Of course we've got our views. Why shouldn't people know what our views are? And if you can express your views well, why shouldn't you write them? And so that's the great thing about a paper like The Guardian, which we're very lucky to have, which the BBC doesn't have and the New York Times doesn't have.
I'm supposed to choose, aren't I? Sorry.
Sorry.
Let this gentleman have a go.
with
He's sitting here.
The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former intelligence analyst with...
Former what?
Former intelligence analyst with Customs and Excise covering the
Right.
ex-Soviet states. And my question is based on work in Yemen, but also mainly on work in the ex-Soviet countries, where many of my former colleagues there were 40th Army veterans, and their comments on the campaign there, certainly on the tactical and operational level, could have been taken straight out of what's happening now, word for word. The first question is, why is it that the same mistakes have been and are being made, given that the Russians left over 10 years before NATO went in? And secondly, in some of your more recent visits back, when things were starting about tentative talks with the Taliban, do you have any impression that the international military, but particularly civilian aid agencies, are capable of gearing up to taking these changes into account, so that they leave something solid or are prepared to work with a dramatically changed situation? The reason for that second point is, based on my time in Yemen, as opposed to with the ex-Soviet colleagues, I found that civilian international agencies can sometimes be very uncomfortable in taking into account political and particularly military issues. It's not their secret.
Let's leave it there, because there's a lot to get through there.
That was the end.
Okay.
So the first point was, why did the Americans make the same mistakes? Well, I mean, the big mistake was to go in there, wasn't it? And it is extraordinary that they went in, given that they'd been helping the people who were fighting the Soviet Union. You couldn't say Americans had no backstory, no history. They should have known that a foreign, non-Muslim occupying power will meet resistance, armed resistance. And it will be very, very difficult, particularly to push your hearts and minds campaign, or whatever you want to call it, pacification, into the rural parts of the country, where people will see it as a jihad to get rid of the foreign infidels who've come in. But I suppose it was a combination of hubris. They thought they could win easily, and they did topple the Taliban very easily. And then they thought they could sort of, having quotes liberated women, they thought we can now bring modernization and development to the country and a new constitution and so on. And so regime change morphed into nation building without any public discussion. So I think it was all those things. And then obviously there's a sort of US can-do thing about, you know, we never fail and we always prevail and all that sort of thing. And so we, you know, the Russians are inefficient and blah, blah, we can do it. So it was sort of carry over from the sort of Cold War victory mentality, I suppose. But on the other thing about civilian international aid agencies, well, I would just differentiate between the smaller agencies like Oxfam and Médecins Sans Frontières and things like that, which are sort of on the ground much more and have a lot of experience of developing countries, from the sort of these big things that have been going in now more recently. But I mean, one of the sad things about this war, and of course it was the same in Iraq as well, is the way the aid agencies are sucked into a kind of counterinsurgency agenda willy-nilly, whether they want to be or not, and therefore then they get perceived by the local people as part of the counterinsurgency. Therefore they become targets very often, and it's very difficult. I mean, you know, when I was in Helmand last year, at the Provincial Reconstruction Team headquarters, the PRT, where all the sort of USAID people sit and the British DFID people sit, they have almost no contact at all with Afghans, particularly with independent Afghans who are not on their own payroll. It's one thing to meet the governor, but his salary has basically been paid by the US or Britain, or some of the local prosecutor or the justice, the judge or something. And when I was sort of embedded in this PRT thing, and I said, well, I'd like to meet some local Afghans. I mean, it was a sort of kind of faux naive question, because I knew that the answer would be no, but I just wanted to hear the explanation. They said, oh, no. And I said, well, why not? They said, well, they don't want to come to the PRT. It's too dangerous for them to be seen coming to the PRT. I said, well, we could always go to their offices, couldn't we? And they said, ooh, no, we travel everywhere in sort of 3-car armoured convoys with security guards and all the rest of it. And they don't want that kind of apparatus suddenly parking outside their front door, because that also will compromise them. So I said, well, how do you meet these local NGOs and Afghans and so on? They said, well, sometimes we can, organize a meeting in the governor's office or one of the district offices or something. So basically they end up hardly ever speaking to an ordinary Afghan.
More questions? We've got like... I saw you. Yeah.
First, thank you for writing this book. Look forward to reading it. I'm John Imel. I'm a recovering purveyor of pipe dreams. And my question is, looking forward, do you think the Taliban will have any interest in economic development by, this will sound naive, by business rather than NGOs and nations?
Well, one of the extraordinary things in this Ramadan statement that I mentioned by Mullah Muhammad Omar is he talked about developing the country and saying we've got a lot of mineral wealth. He said including with foreign investment. So, he seemed very welcoming to it. So I don't see any reason why they wouldn't. They know that they have a very rich country, but it's potentially in terms of mineral wealth, but they don't have the expertise, technology and whatnot to get it out.
You think this would be a good thing?
Did he what?
Would this be a good thing?
Well, as long as all the profits don't end up in Texas.
Julia McFarlane. I'm studying international journalism at City University. You may agree that several things have changed modern war reporting. Health and safety has made it, in many cases, pretty impossible for journalists to go anywhere without a small security entourage. And the advent of live news has burdened reporters maybe with the bulkier equipment needed to transmit live feeds, which often places them at the edge of the action. obviously exceptions. Alex Crawford in Libya, perhaps, is the most recent one. I wanted to ask, what are your feelings on this new face of war reporting? Because on the one hand, it makes it safer for journalists, but also they miss out on some of the scoops.
No, well, I mean, you talked about equipment. I mean, you know, I'm always very thankful that I've been a print newspaper journalist because I don't have to carry enormous amounts of equipment. You know, I've got a biro, which I hope it'll work. Sometimes, you know, I've got an old notebook, and that's about it. You know, and you can be much more, you know, invisible. And also, it's much better for your shoulder not to have to carry all this stuff. But the safety thing, I mean, again, there are upsides and downsides to this. You know, we are safer now that we wear this equipment, and we think more seriously about the risks and take it, and do these health and hostile environment courses and stuff, and have some rudimentary first aid knowledge and whatnot, and how to behave in a crisis. So all that is good, but the downside is that you either yourself don't go somewhere where you think you ought to go because you decide that the risk is too much, or your security advisor tells you, because they're paid basically to say no. You know, if you ring them and say, you know, these people we have on our payroll in the Kabul office or in Baghdad when it was hot, you know, should I go out? And they're supposed to, you know, they read all the sit reps from the intelligence agencies telling you where the latest threat might be coming from. You know, they have much more of that stuff coming in than you do as an ordinary journalist who's not privy to that. And so they say, oh, no, don't go down that road. There's something, you try this road, but that's also very bad. And so on. So you end up sort of, it's in their interest to say no, because they don't want to, you know, a dead body and somebody saying, well, why did you tell that person the road was clear when it wasn't? So you know, you've got that kind of constraint all the time. So you have to take your own, sort of make your own judgment ultimately. And The Guardian always gives you that right, and I don't know of any case where anybody's been penalised. In some organisations, I know people who've refused to go to a story on safety grounds have then been told by their organisation later that they were sort of hinted that they were a bit chicken and they're not going to be put on these assignments in the future. Well, I've never heard any whiff of that on The Guardian.
Can I just add to that as well, that I feel people are talking about the golden age of the foreign correspondent, but at the same time I feel like a gap has emerged now for the freelancer. I would say that, but there is now this space which can be occupied by people who are willing to work for different people without the same guarantees necessarily of security and finance that you had. And I also think the lines are breaking down. You're a print journalist, I'm a print journalist, but actually there's a blurring now, and young freelancers, or whatever you want to call them, are actually expected to be able to shoot video, edit video, send files, do audio interviews on the phone, and then file your copy. So I think there is changing, and there is a blurring of the lines going on between the traditional print journalist versus the person in front of the camera.
No, that's true, but I think that's yet another problem when you're trying to. You need time and quiet to think about what the story is and what the best way to present it is, what it all means, and so on. And if you're under this constant pressure, the 24-hour news cycle thing, and getting the pictures out, and getting the audio and doing the podcast, somebody's going to ring in 10 minutes from London, and you've got to sort of be ready to spout on the phone. It all impedes. And then there's a cost-cutting element. It's much better for the paper to have one person doing 5 people's jobs than 5 people doing 5 people's jobs. So it is very difficult, but it's also very satisfying. People feel they're a jack of all trades and so on, and you can do a damn good audio report, and I can also do a fantastic, stand-up to piece to camera, as well as writing a brilliantly fine-tuned, all the right epithets in all the right places, 1,500 words for The Guardian.
But what I wonder is when you were witnessing this breaking news, if I was now witnessing something like that and not communicating it by a tweet or whatever, I'd feel incredibly frustrated. I'd feel like there was news there that I couldn't get out. But what you're saying, I guess, is that you enjoyed the time to think and the space that lack of technology gave you, that you couldn't constantly tweet and text what you saw and constantly be hassled by editors. Gave you some breathing time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it depends if you are in a breaking news sort of media organization, then you have to do all that. But ideally, you're in one which isn't only on news, because as I said, as somebody else's question, you know, it's coming
from other places.
From other places. It's coming from sort of Al Jazeera much quicker than you can do it, and or it's coming on somebody's Facebook page, or you know, there's something being uploaded to YouTube or whatever. So I think, as I said, the bearing witness element, you know, the sort of scoop thing. I was the first person there. You know, it's exciting to have that. But maybe it's not I was the first person there, but I did the story that people really remembered, because it had some context and explanation and some sort of fantastic interviews in it.
We've got about 5 minutes left.
Jeremy Walker, BBC World Service News. I'm just interested, you know, you say now you've stepped back a bit, but you still go on these occasional forays. How do you choose your stories now? What's your criteria for deciding, yeah, I'm going to go off, I'm going to hit that?
Well, that sounds a little bit too much as though I'm some kind of star who can just sort of say, I'm now here, you know, and people will rush and sort of say, when do you want to go where, and so on. It's not like that. I mean, I went to Iraq a year ago in August because the US combat troops were pulling out, and I'd been there when they came in April 2003, and so they wanted it, you know, it's like sort of bookends, you know, at the beginning and at the end, and I was the person who'd been there at the beginning, and now I could be at the end and explain what had changed in the 7 years that the Americans had been in Iraq. So that was, I had a sort of unique, not entirely unique, there were other people in the Guardian also there in April 2003, but I was available. Stance on that. When I went to Helmand for this PRT thing that I was there, I was actually invited by the Department for International Development. I'm not sure they were terribly happy with the result, but you know, they got in touch with me because they knew I'd written about Afghanistan. They said, would you like to come on a trip and see what's happening to British aid and the taxpayers' money and so on? So I thought, well, why not go on that? So it's a combination of sometimes being asked and sometimes pushing and not always getting what you want.
Hello, my name is Mali. I'm a UK correspondent for a Canadian daily. I wanted to ask you, how do you keep a fresh look on a story that, you know, when you're based in the country after a few years, 5, 6 years, which is my case, and I feel like I'm going through a bit of an inspiration crisis, like I'm lacking a bit of enthusiasm for my stories because I see the same patterns, the same stories coming, you know, over and over again. So how do you, what would be your advice? How do you keep a fresh look? And when you lack maybe inspiration, what do you do to get out of the rut?
Maybe have 2 months off, if you can afford it, or they'll let you, you know, get a fresh eye. But no, but obviously there's, I mean, we lived for 6 years in Russia between 1988 and 1994, and I did get quite tired. But you know, Russia was changing so dramatically that, you know, the story was changing too fast to get sort of bored. But I did find ultimately that the sort of scope of what I could do differed. And I always said, you know, I came to Moscow as a political correspondent in 1988. I'm leaving in 1994 as a crime reporter.
Just coming now, Jacqueline Peach from AFP News Agency. Similar kind of question. When you in your book, you talk about the errors that that the Americans are making in Afghanistan, and this repetition. It's something that you see in many areas. How do you, and you talk about the cynicism, how do you remain optimistic about the future of the world?
Well, I mean, the Arab Spring has changed an awful lot. It's not quite as rosy and exciting as it seemed, you know, in January, February this year. You know, but it is a fantastic thing. So I think that is really great because it's one of the last areas of the world that seemed to be mired in a kind of dictatorship syndrome, and it would never change. And so that's been really sort of dramatic. I think this Occupy movement is incredible, and the you know, there's a great advantage of a new technology, you know, the links between Wisconsin and Tahrir Square and so on, and now, you know, if you go to St. Paul's, there's a thing on the wall saying Tahrir Square EC4. So, you know, it is incredible that, you know, how there's always a new upsurge. I mean, democracy is being reborn all the time. And so that sort of keeps me optimistic. And you just hope that the sort of better side of these movements predominate over the worse sides.
Okay, thank you. I think.
Is that all right?
Is that all right? Thanks. I think we're there. That's 8:30. So thanks everyone for coming. And Jonathan's here with his books, which everyone needs to buy, definitely.
And I can even sign if you wanted.